Okay, guys, welcome to the last part of Lab 1, Neuroanatomy. We're going to move forward and go right into the Diencephalon and move on down to the midbrain, the Medulla Oblongata, and all that fun stuff. We'll talk a little bit about physiology and then move on to the blood vessels and the meninges. I'm not going to make a model review of this just because we have so much to go through and we're already kind of loaded up on videos. So I think this video we're just gonna do with the slideshow here. Okay, so let's get on with it. This shouldn't take too long because I'm not gonna go too in depth. And I'll let you know kind of the things that you definitely need to know for your exam so you can study. I know you guys got a lot going on with the Caduceus assignments in the lecture, and you got a lot of stuff going on in lecture to begin with. So let's move forward. Okay, so like I said, we're going to discuss the diencephalon here. The brain stem, which includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And then previously we discussed the cerebral hemisphere, so we kind of went over that stuff already. Okay, so the picture on the right shouldn't be foreign to you. We've discussed secondary brain vesicles and the mature brain vesicles early on. But here you get a good image of a cadaver brain. And you can see where the cerebral cortex kind of finishes or ends, which is kind of this area right here. And then this portion right here, this is called the corpora callosum or the corpus callosum, however you want to call it. But the corpora callosum, this is really the tissue that connects the right and the left hemispheres together. So this tissue right here is kind of a communication highway between the two sides of the brain. Okay, let me kind of delete this stuff here. All right, really important stuff that we went over previously. Remember the telencephalon, okay? As we can see right here, the telencephalon is the secondary brain vesicle that eventually turns into the cerebral hemispheres, which is your cortex and your basal ganglia and your limbic system. Okay, the diencephalon is a secondary brain vesicle, and the diencephalon kind of remains the same name in the mature brain. We call it the diencephalon. Okay, and the diencephalon is made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Okay, this doesn't have epithalamus listed here, but that is part of the diencephalon as well. And basically our thalamus is this whole region through here. Okay, this is our thalamus. Well, this is really one of the ventricles. We'll go over ventricles here in a minute. But this is the thalamus region here. Okay, and then we have our hypothalamus here. All right, and our hypothalamus contains our pituitary gland, which is really just kind of going crazy here, highlighting that. And then back here is our epithalamus, okay? And our epithalamus contains our pineal gland, all right? I went a little bit too far down right here. I shouldn't have gone this far down. We can kind of, our epithalamus is really just this region here. This portion here is a part of our hind brain, or midbrain, I should say. Okay. Let me kind of delete this stuff here. All right, so our midbrain, which was the mesencephalon, our midbrain is really this whole region here. And remember from earlier, I talked about the corpora quadrigeminum. And these are the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. We have 4 of them. They're right here. That's a part of our midbrain, and those are really important and have to do with auditory information and visual information kind of going on through, whether it be into the occipital lobe or into the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so moving on, we have our pons just below, and our pons region, as you can see, is right through here. Okay, and what's interesting about the pons is basically a communication distribution center. That's a really good way to think of it. It's a communication distribution center, and it does a really good job of communicating things up from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. So it does a really good job of being the intercommunication highway for information that is going up and down the spinal cord and into the cerebellum and then up into the cerebral cortex. So that's the pons. And you can see that the pons is loaded with white matter. Okay. All right. Let's move on. All right. So let's go into detail here with the diencephalon, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So the diencephalon, here are the things that you need to know about the diencephalon, okay? And it does a lot more than this. This is just real brief, all right? But the diencephalon, sorry about that, the diencephalon is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, okay? But the diencephalon, the things that you need to know is, first of all, what the thalamus does. And the thalamus relays and processes information that is going to the somatosensory cortex and then back on down. So it's kind of like a relay center, all right? The hypothalamus, really important, all right? So the hypothalamus here, this region, is really, really important because it has to do with a lot of hormonal functions, okay? The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work in unison with the thyroid gland. And when we get to the endocrine system, we're really going to talk about how the electrical chemical communication with the neurotransmitters in the central nervous system and how that is involved in communicating and synapsing and then eventually releasing hormones, that those hormones can be very, very similar in their molecular structure to the neurotransmitters that are released. For instance, whether we're releasing growth hormone, okay, or growth factor, you know, those neurotransmitters are released and then they release and synapse in the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland then releases growth hormone, okay? Now moving on to the midbrain. Midbrain, as you can read, really does a good job of processing that visual auditory data. That's over in that corpora quadragentum, in that posterior aspect. Okay, we can see that right here and right here with the superior and inferior colliculi. Okay, and there's 4 of them. You only see 2 here, but there's 2 on both sides. All right, another thing that the midbrain does is it is involved with the reflexes of the somatomotor responses, so the somatic motor responses. And it's thought to play a role in consciousness. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. All right, so as I said earlier with the pons, we look just down below. The pons is a communication relay center. Really, really important. Relays communication between the cerebellum and the thalamus, which then eventually goes up in synapses into the cerebral cortex, okay? And it's also involved, as you can see, with the somatic and the visceral motor sensors, or centers. So the visceral motor centers, that's motor centers that are involved with basically digestive system, so on and so forth, and it's kind of a relay center for that. The medulla oblongata is really important with digestive system activity. So they kind of work hand in hand. Obviously, the whole entire brain and central nervous system works hand in hand. Whatever its function is, it usually synapses with something else that either supports it or relays it to another area of the central nervous system. So the medulla oblongata relays sensory information to the thalamus and then to other portions of the brain. You notice if you look here, we get a constant reoccurrence of the thalamus being involved. That's because that thalamus is that relay sensor for the cerebral cortex. Okay, remember that the cerebral cortex, a lot of the outer portion of the cerebral cortex is basically made up of cell bodies. Okay, so this is all cell bodies through here. All right, so this is where our neurons are really doing their job of that chemical electrical communication that occurs, and then their axons come on down through, whether they go through the corpus corpore callosum and cross hemispheres, or they go on down through into the thalamus, and then the thalamus relays it, so on and so forth, down to the relevant areas, whether it be the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, the pons, into the cerebellum. Okay. All right, let's see. Medulla oblongata, did we miss anything? Really important region of the brain, as it contains a lot of areas that are associated with survival functions. And what do I mean by survival functions? Well, I mean respiration, cardiovascular functions, heart rate, digestive functions, all the things that we don't have to think of. So this is a lot of autonomic nervous system activity. So activity that we don't really have to process or have a conscious awareness of. And you notice that it's really low on down, right? As far as the central nervous system is concerned, it's right near the beginning of the spinal cord. And the reason for that is it's relatively protected very well. This is at the base of our skull going into our spinal canal. All right. So we don't want this higher up, because if we bang our head and we get an injury to that region, that's not good. Okay. So this area of the body, and this area of the skull, and this area of the central nervous system is protected, and we need this to be protected because it has a lot of our vital organ functions. Okay. All right, it's just a really cool picture of the cadaver. Here you get a really good image of the cranial nerves, which we haven't gone over yet, but we're going to go through all 12 cranial nerves, starting with this guy right here, the olfactory. And then we have, optic and ocular motor, so on and so forth. And we go down, we'll get to the trigeminal and the vestibulocochlear and the facial and all that stuff. So we're going to go through the cranial nerves later on. But here's a good image, and we'll probably get back to this image so you can see some of the stuff that deals with the cranial nerves, and we'll go into detail of what the cranial nerves actually do and what their functions are. But this is a pretty good image. So we see our cerebellum, we see our cerebral cortex, okay, the right and left hemispheres. We can see the frontal lobe here. This is that lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the superior portion lobes, okay? And then we see the inferior aspect of our diencephalon, and then moving on down to the midbrain, and then the pons, and then the medulla oblongata, okay? All right, so what does the cerebellum do? Remember, the cerebellum and the pons are really interactive together, and they grew from the same secondary brain vesicle. But what are the functions of the cerebellum? So the cerebellum has a lot of several more interdivisions than what's listed. These are just the kind of the primary divisions of the cerebellum. And what you need to know from this is not necessarily, I'm not going to test you on the actual divisions themselves because that really gets in depth. But just know what some of the things of the cerebellum are. You may have a question of, what is a function of the cerebellum? Okay, and there may be a multiple choice question that you have to fill out. I haven't designed the lab quiz yet, but there may be something like that. So, what are some of the functions of the cerebellum? Well, this slide really does a good job of saying it. So kind of take notes on this slide. Regulation of muscle tone, coordination of skilled voluntary movement. So what do we mean by skilled? So skilled is basically, if you're thinking it from a training standpoint, let's think about this from if you're a physical therapist, occupational therapist, athletic trainer, or even strength coach. A lot of the skilled voluntary movement that is involved with post-rehabilitative care, such as ACL rehabilitation. If I'm in end stage of ACL rehabilitation and I'm working with an athlete that's a soccer player, well, I need to start doing some coordination drills, some higher level, what's called proprioceptive drills that really involve voluntary action. So running through a ladder or doing a change of direction exercise due to an external stimulus, maybe a verbal cue, or maybe I'm a running back and I caught the ball and I'm running and I have to juke out a player based on their movements. Okay, that's skilled voluntary movement. Another way to think about skilled voluntary movement is ping pong. Okay, playing ping pong well, all right, or playing golf well. Okay, those are skilled voluntary movements. A lot of hand-eye coordination stuff is involved. The cerebellum is involved with as well. So muscle tone, voluntary activity, planning of voluntary activity. So this is that change of direction stuff, maintenance of balance, precise eye movements. So really precise eye movements occur here, or the cerebellum is involved in. That's better said. Okay. So these are some of the functions of the cerebellum. Really kind of interesting portion of the brain that it's not really up into the cerebral cortex, that is kind of lower. So I don't know. For me, the cerebellum is one of the neatest pieces of tissue that is in our central nervous. Okay, it's kind of a whole picture. You've seen this one before. It was just up a few slides ago, kind of summing it all up. So the cerebral cortex, the corpora callosum, the diencephalon, the pineal gland, which is in this posterior aspect here, the pituitary gland, the midbrain, okay, the pons, the cerebellum. We can see our cornoid plexus through here. That's what develops cerebral spinal fluid, which we're going to go over here in just a minute. Then our medulla oblongata. Okay, so you need to know all that stuff. Okay, so our meninges. If you've ever heard of meningitis, okay, there's viral meningitis and bacterial meningitis. If you've ever heard of meningitis, then you have heard of the meninges, okay? So the meninges surrounds the neuronal tissue. Let me say that again. The meninges surround the neuronal tissue of our central nervous system, okay? And here we have our scalp, the periosteum. If we remember from 216, the periosteum is the sheath that covers bone. So it's the outer covering of bone. Here we have our skull. Our skull is made up of spongy bone, okay? And then we have the beginning of the Dura Mater, okay? The Dura Mater is basically the meninges, all right? Or it contains the meninges, all right? And the first layer is what's called the periosteal or periosteal meningeal layer, okay? And that's right here, all right? After the periosteal I don't know why I'm having such a problem saying these today. After the periosteal meninge, we have the meningeal layer. Okay, so this is basically the outer covering of the meninges, and then we have the meningeal layer here. Okay, so this is the periosteal Dura Mater, and then the meningeal Dura Mater. All right, I probably was confusing earlier with the way that I was calling it. Sorry. So know it as the periosteal Dura Mater and then the meningeal Dura Mater. All right, so those are the first two layers that we get, and they kind of surround the neuronal tissue. But there's a space in between that, and there's one tiny piece of matter in between that, and that's the arachnoid matter. And the arachnoid matter is really, really small and thin, not small, excuse me, thin, better to say. And this is where our cerebral spinal fluid kind of flows through and around, okay? And our cerebral spinal fluid will kind of flow up and through here and then back into these venous vesicles that then return the flow of cerebral spinal fluid back through, okay? Underneath the arachnoid matter is the Pia Mater, and the Pia Mater is that outer layer of the neuroanatomy tissue, and it is basically the tissue, the beginning tissue of the brain itself, okay? That's the way that I want you guys to know it as. Right here, this is our longitudinal fissure. If you remember our longitudinal fissure that separates the two cerebral hemispheres, and in between the longitudinal fissure is this piece of tissue that goes around above the arachnoid matter that's called the phalanx cerebri, okay? And in between the phalanx cerebri, as it goes up and through, and the arachnoid matter is a really small space called the subdural space. Okay, the subdural space. If you've ever heard of a subdural hematoma, that is basically bleeding in between this space. If that occurs, that's bad news bears, because that increases pressure, which then increases pressure on the cerebral spinal fluid, which then increases pressure onto the brain itself, and that can do some really bad brain damage. Okay, so that's not good, a subdural hematoma. All right, underneath the arachnoid matter, remember that thin, real thin piece of tissue underneath the meninges, or the meningeal Dura Mater. Underneath that is called, in between the Pia Mater, is called the subarachnoid space. Go ahead and star this slide. I would absolutely behoove all of you to study this side, because you will get a question where these are empty and you have to plug and chug and connect the dots, okay? Basically matching, all right? Okay, this is just a neat picture of a cadaver. Hopefully you can stand some cadaver stuff like so. On the left, this is a good image of the space in our skull, and if we remove our brain itself, how the spaces are, and this large vein that comes on through that helps to not only return blood, but helps to return cerebral spinal fluid all the way through into the tissue. So this is just a good image on the right side here of the meninges and the various layers. Kind of neat. Okay. I'm not going to test you on this. We just don't have enough time, because we have a lot more to go through in Lab 1. Okay. But know this. What's important about this is how blood flows through. And one of the most important aspects of circulation of blood is right here. The circle of Willis. Okay, the circle of Willis. So blood comes up from the carotid artery, specifically the internal carotid artery from our neck, the anterior lateral aspect of our neck, if you remember back from 216, and it goes up into the circle of Willis, and that's how oxygen-rich blood is distributed throughout the brain, okay, especially the outer layers of the brain in the cerebral cortex, okay. Oh, there we go. There's a good picture of it. All right, so longitudinal fissure cut in half here, and we can see the right lobe. I know it's the right lobe. Why? That's because this is anterior, this is posterior, all right? Temporal lobe, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, frontal lobe. Kind of my crazy drawing, okay? But you can see here how the framework in the artery is. Our brain uses a lot of blood, and specifically it is fueled by glucose, so carbohydrates. Really important that you don't go too crazy on a low carbohydrate diet, because carbohydrates are the primary fuel source for our brain, okay, for brain metabolism. Really important. All right. These are our ventricles. The ventricles in the brain are spaces that exist within the brain so that cerebral spinal fluid can be, number one, created or developed by the plexuses that exist within the cerebral spaces in the ventricles. And cerebral spinal fluid has an area to flow in. So let's go over that. All right. So first of all, we have our lateral ventricles, which are known as ventricles 1 and 2, and then our third ventricle and our fourth ventricle, okay? Here's another good view of that. And then let's talk about how the flow occurs, okay? Now that you see both a frontal view and a sagittal view, let's talk about the flow, because you definitely need to know this, and I would pay attention to this and this. So make sure you take notes. By the way, I am okay with my tests being open note tests. All right, especially during online only, okay, and especially during summer. Now, if you're hearing this and you're in the fall and you're in my course that is not online only, then obviously we can't have an open note test. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. Let's see. I might be a nice guy and say open note test. Okay. All right. So first things first. Follow this through. Read this. Take notes. Okay. So cerebral spinal fluid is secreted by the choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles. Okay. So secreted here in the lateral ventricles, and then flows up and out through the lateral ventricles. In the lateral ventricles, there's little areas where sinuses, if you will, that bathe this tissue, okay? And then it flows downward and into the interventricular foramen and into the third ventricle, okay? Then the third ventricle, the choroid plexus adds to cerebral spinal fluid, okay? And then that cerebral spinal fluid flows into a aqueduct, into the cerebral aqueduct here. From the cerebral aqueduct, it flows into the fourth ventricle, all right? From the fourth ventricle, there is a choroid plexus that then adds more cerebral spinal fluid. And then from the fourth ventricle, the cerebral spinal fluid flows out to the lateral apertures, okay? And from the lateral apertures, it moves on through. It can either go down the spinal cord or it can go through and around the cerebellum. It goes around and through the cerebellum, and it then fills into the subarachnoid spaces and bathes the external surfaces of the brain. Okay, so it comes through here and then through the subarachnoid spaces. Okay, and from the subarachnoid spaces, then it actually hits this region here. These guys are called the arachnoid villi, and in the arachnoid villi, the cerebral spinal fluid enters into venous return. Okay, so into this venous return area here, to then flow back on through into the venous blood of the dural venous sinuses. Okay, so that's basically the flow. You need to know the flow, and there may be a question of put in order the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid, and there'll be a plug and chug sort of matching sort of deal. Okay. All right, once again, flow of cerebral spinal fluid. This is the same picture from that previous slide. So go through this again, but I want you to go through this now while looking at the frontal view. So go ahead and just pause this, look at this for a minute, look at the different ventricles, the first and second ventricle, which are the lateral ventricles, then your third ventricle, all right, then your fourth ventricle, and then how it flows on through. So pay attention to this, follow the structure, go through the flow one more time, looking at it from a frontal view. All right, so you can pause that and kind of look at it.